We're going to be talking today about men's movement, Christian men's movements. Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell, Promise Keepers, not to be confused with Oath Keepers, right? I got that confused myself. We're going to be looking at Phyllis Schlafly just for a minute, and Hillary Clinton shows up in this, as well as the Mars Hill Church from Seattle, the Quiverful movement, as well as a group called the Vineyard. Has anybody ever been part of a Vineyard church? A lot of people have, because it's a big outfit. And I think what happened to them in the 90s is really fascinating, and is tangential but interesting nevertheless. So I'm going to do what I did last week and just take us through various readings and then pause between them, of course, for your connections and comments and questions if you have those. In August of 1980, that's when this portion begins, only a month after the Long Beach Pro-Family Conference, Christian leaders gathered again, this time in Dallas, at the national meeting of the Religious Roundtable. With American flags waving and shouts of hallelujah ringing, speakers warned of the nation's moral decline and diminishing military might. Masterminded by televangelist James Robison, the event brought together Falwell, Schlafly, and Tim LaHaye, along with Pat Robertson, D. James Kennedy, and prominent conservatives, including Republican Senator Jesse Helms, Amway co-founder Richard DeVos, and Dallas Cowboys coach Tom Landry. So, you know, not the My Pillow guy, but it's the same. You know, you just take one out and you put a new one in, and it's the same crazy thing. Okay. And evangelist Robison was there to convert his audience to politics. Okay, this is when this whole movement gained some traction politically. He said, "Not voting is a sin against Almighty God. I'm sick and tired of hearing about all the radicals and the perverts and the liberals and the leftists and the communists coming out of the closet." Whoa. Let me attempt to recover from that. Coming out of the closet, hint, hint. It's time for God's people to come out of the closet, out of the churches, and change America. Robison wasn't just calling for political participation, he was calling for partisan activism. Political salvation could be found in the Republican Party. After Robison had riled up the crowd, the guest of honor took his place behind the lectern. "I know that you can't endorse me," the Republican nominee for president in 1980 quipped, "but I want you to know that I endorse you and your program." In Ronald Reagan, the religious right had found their leader. There you go. That's where we are. True, Reagan's religious credentials left something to be desired. Although a Presbyterian, Presbyterians show up at every place in this thing. I mean, we're always mentioned, dang it. Although a Presbyterian, his church attendance was sporadic. Theirs was also the matter of his divorce. Jane Wyman, remember? Who found Ronald Reagan to be dull and a chatterbox. That's funny, you read about that. I cut him a lot of slack in that regard. Anyway, Reagan was not the best Christian who ever walked the face of the earth, acknowledged one leader of the Christian right. This is interesting how they were holding their nose for Ronald Reagan compared to what came later. Yeah, Ronald Reagan looks like the choir boy par excellence, doesn't he? But we really didn't have a choice, the man said. This is, just take the words out, plug them in. 35 years later, the same story. His record as governor of California was also mixed. He had supported the ERA. He did, supported the ERA. Legalized therapeutic abortion and refused to support an anti-gay rights referendum. But by 1980, he had become proficient in conservative talking points. He supported prayer and the teachings of creationism in public schools, came out against abortion, and reversed course on the ERA, deciding that it denigrated stay-at-home mothers and would force women into combat. Okay. He placed Beverly LaHaye on his campaign's Family Policy Advisory Board. What had drawn Reagan to the Republican Party were the same things that had drawn evangelicals, a mixture of anti-communism, Christian nationalism, and nostalgia for a mythical American past. Once again, here we are. By the time he took the stage in Dallas, Reagan was fluent in the language of the Christian right, echoing Goldwater years earlier. He promised peace through strength. Rejecting Jimmy Carter's despair and pessimism, he declared that America could still become that shining city upon a hill. Okay. This woman does a really good job of giving us it all together and clear. Your interest, comments, anything here? Yeah. Thank you.
I'm being reminded these days of the simple teachings of Christ. One of those is love your enemies.
Right.
And Ronald Reagan has been one of my enemies for years. Do you remember, what was it, 1980? I might have my years wrong. But he opened up and then closed all the doors of all mental institutions. Do you know that is why we have hundreds of thousands of people who are homeless, don't even know their own name? If they did, they wouldn't be able to speak it. I am sick at heart at the homelessness and the rise in mental illness, emotional illness. It sickens me to heart. And I realized, I was reminded, well, that came into being because he slammed the doors on all such medical help for people. Just one person's exasperation.
Okay, well said. Wayne?
Oh, thank you. There it is. One of the things that struck me as I read the next 100 pages or so is that neo-Calvinists were mentioned frequently, particularly around the Promise Keepers, and also the Presbyterian Church and its relationship to that movement. And I don't remember which brand of Presbyterianism it was, but I had never really, I guess I had not followed this, that I'd never heard about neo-Calvinism. And I'd been recently trying to find out what Calvin believed, and I didn't know how that all fit in. I don't know if that struck anybody else that way or not.
It's a minor chapter in this, less political than other chapters. Comes out of Orthodox Presbyterianism, pretty much. Is small, kind of fringy. But, you know, and I want you to keep that in mind when we talk about the Vineyard Group. The relationship of evangelicals with liturgy, the church year, the accoutrements of ritual is very interesting. And I think if we don't look at it, we miss something about our own worship and why we do what we do. So anyway, thank you for bringing that up at this point. There we go.
Well, another thing I've read about Reagan that really horrifies me is he was obsessed with the Sandinistas and
Right.
Nicaragua and wanted to keep communism out of the Americas. And one thing he did, I can't tell you all the details, was he allowed he wanted to raise money and Congress would not allocate money for the Contras. So he just did whatever he wanted, all kinds of nefarious things to raise money. And one of them was to work with or allow drug cartels in South America and Panama to bring drugs to the U.S., and they set up and black drug kingpins to distribute them to the black community. And this is all the detailed. There was a reporter in San Jose who wrote about this, and it's also discussed in the book White Rage by Carol Anderson. And I think more people should know about it. He was the Just Say No president, and he brought drugs in, especially to the black community, which the gangs became much more violent after that, acquired more guns and so forth, and mass incarceration of blacks followed that.
That I didn't know.
In the book that we're reading, going to discuss on Tuesday night, it's a longer history, and it helps me see that some of these things in this book are echoes of things past, or had other factors going on. And a couple things that come up. One is, in 1980, you had in American society a kind of lingering frustration over Vietnam, and you had a lot of like Vietnam veterans who didn't like the way that ended and wanted to get out and do something. And so Reagan's kind of international adventurism in Central America and trying to remold the world and all of that was tapping into a lot of that leftover frustration from Vietnam and wanting to go back to making America great, throw its weight around in the rest of the world after this big kind of retreat that happened after Vietnam. And that was part of what people didn't like about Carter, is that he was like, no, I don't want to go and start wars overseas. The other thing I'll mention is that Reaganism really echoes what was happening right after the Civil War with Andrew Johnson. And all of the people that said, okay, we've got all these freed slaves, we got to help them get established and stuff. All this rhetoric came out against that said, and President Andrew Johnson said this, if we help the freed slaves, then they will just become slaves of the federal government instead of their former masters. And so the way to help them is to give them nothing. And sort of that whole sort of blaming the poor for poverty sort of thing goes all the way back there and back further.
Wow. Okay. All righty. Let me move us on a little bit. In the early 1980s, a campaign to halt the production of nuclear weapons had been gaining momentum. This presbytery in 1980 started something called a peacemaking committee. I got to be on that at that time. Was really an interesting moment. Many Christians supported the idea of a nuclear freeze, including some evangelicals, surprising many. Billy Graham had come out in the late 70s in favor of SALT II, an agreement to limit the development of missile programs, fearing that the destructive power of nuclear weapons contradicted the Christian faith. I don't think we can underestimate the effect that Billy Graham's statements about nuclear weapons, and he was incredibly outspoken about it, didn't care where he said what he said. Maybe soft-pedaled it here and there, I don't know, but I was so impressed with him using his power in that regard. He had learned things about this country, and he wasn't going to let people shut him up on that regard. And it's too bad. I guess a lot of people just said, well, that's Billy, and ignored him. But it's interesting. Nevertheless, Christianity Today too endorsed Mark Hatfield's plan for a complete freeze on the development, testing, and deployment of strategic missile systems. Many leaders of the Christian right, however, thought otherwise. Falwell promised Reagan he would help get his message out, quote, in layman's language, and he did so by taking out full-page ads in major newspapers deriding freezeniks ultra-libs, and ultra-lateral disarmers who were undermining Reagan's effort to rebuild the nation's military strength. We cannot afford to be number 2 in defense, he warned. Televangelists also came to Reagan's aid in selling the Strategic Defense Initiative, popularly known as Star Wars, as a moral imperative. 2 weeks after Reagan called for the space-based nuclear defense system, he appeared before the National Association of Evangelicals. Again, he left no doubt that he was on their side, rattling off a list of conservative talking points and reciting a popular but spurious de Tocqueville quote, "If America ever ceases to be good, America will cease to be great." Interesting. Evangelicals, he added, were the ones, quote, "keeping America great by keeping her good," unquote. When it came to risks of nuclear annihilation, evangelical theology's emphasis on eternal life for the faithful helped mitigate such earthly terrors as nuclear war. In end-time scenarios, they believed God would protect them. A nuclear holocaust might even be part of God's plan. That's what Putin's supporters are saying on the equivalent of the Today Show in Russia right now. Not that it'd be God's plan, but that, it'd be okay. That's kind of scary. But a strong military and an aggressive foreign policy also aligned with evangelicals' view of masculine power. Representatives of the Christian right were not above insinuating a deficit of manliness among those who opposed the president's policies. Friesniks were sissies who lacked the courage to stand up to the communist threat, the Russian communist threat. It's also crazy, isn't it? Anybody involved in the Freeze movement back in the day? Right. We had a big Freeze demonstration in a waterfront park in, 84, 83? I can't remember when it was. Yeah.
My mom and I encircled Rocky Flats where they made the plutonium triggers for the atom bombs just outside of Boulder.
Yeah.
Went to demonstrations
got
in
arrested
Houston.
several times out there.
Yeah.
Yes?
Went to demonstrations in Houston.
There you go.
I was with the Beyond War movement, the Beyond War group.
Yeah. I figured a lot of people in this church probably had something to do with it all.
Not with that in particular, but when I was a VISTA volunteer in Colorado Springs, Colorado, just about 2001, I was with the Pikes Peak Justice and Peace Commission. And that was a bit of a challenge because, the largest Army base in our country certainly is right there in Colorado Springs. I am not speaking ill of the military, okay? But what I am saying is war is not the answer. And the Pikes Peak Justice and Peace Commission, we had the U.S. Air Force Academy there. We had Peterson Air Force Base there. We had Fort Carson, the largest Army in the country, if not the world. And so we had quite an interesting uphill climb there with the Pikes Peak Justice and Peace Commission. And we held a peace rally in downtown Colorado Springs. That would have been about 2001 when Bush wanted to go into Iraq. So we put an invitation out to the rest of the state of Colorado, because we said, this peace rally has to happen in Colorado Springs. This is where it has to happen. We had 4,000 plus people show up at that. And we had banners strewn 2 miles east and west on major thoroughfare. We had our peace rally. We had wonderful speakers and everything. But what happened was we were tear gassed by Colorado Springs Police Department. Full riot gear. I have 152 written documents with pictures of police brutality. They were trying to, what's called, disperse the crowd. Insanity. And that night, and they also, some protesters had gone up to Peterson Air Force Base, and they were just holding banners, that's all. But I was up till 7 o'clock that evening visiting families, people who had been put in prison. They had been pulled out of their cars, and they had been pulled out of just their holding posters up at the Dairy Queen next door to Peterson Air Force Base. I'll tell you here again, I'm to love my enemies. I'm having a little difficulty here, folks. Thank you very much. But
It's a good thing that that Putin wasn't in power then, and that, a couple of important things happened. Nancy Reagan told her husband, "You can't do this." And God bless Nancy Reagan.
yeah.
And then Gorbachev was there instead of Putin, and that made those two things kept this world from blowing up worse than it did.
And I'm sorry, I tell
Go
the
ahead.
story because
I think-
it was quite a huge.
I was just going to say, I went to the Presbyterian Peacemaking Conference in Montreat back in 2000 or was it 2000? I'm not sure. Anyway, just down the mountain from Billy Graham's
Right,
enormous estate.
right by it.
But it was no, it's in North Carolina. Yeah, it was an amazing thing, and we did a lot of praying for Donald Rumsfeld because he's also Presbyterian.
Good. Okay. Let me move us on because we have limited time. At the time of the Iran-Contra hearings, a certain subset of Americans had been gripped by Ollie mania. Remember that? Ollie North. A T-shirt store in Albany, New York, sold a shirt emblazoned with an American flag boasting God's guns, guts, and Ollie made this country great. A restaurant near Buffalo added an Oliver North sandwich to their menu, made with red-blooded American beef. Oh my gosh. And topped with shredded lettuce. The sandwich was served up on a hero roll. But North's moment in the spotlight soon came and went. Retailers had a hard time moving Barbie and Ken dolls modeled on North and his wife, and only about half of the 775,000 copies of Pocketbook's paperback edition of North's testimony transcript were expected to sell. Some of these people, their star rises and falls really quickly. Jerry Falwell led the way in lionizing Oliver North. In the spring of '88, he had started a national petition drive to pardon North, and in May of that year, he welcomed North to Liberty University as the school's commencement speaker. When North arrived on campus just one day after retiring from the military, Falwell compared him to Jesus, reminding his audience that, quote, "We serve a Savior who was indicted and convicted and crucified." Falwell christened North a true American hero. So that's the kind of thing that's happening in the 1980s, and it keeps rearing its head. President Reagan, let's see, where's this? President Reagan, even as he claimed ignorance of Oliver North's actions, heralded him as an American hero, but not everyone agreed. Democratic Senator George Mitchell, a devout Catholic with his own military pedigree, rebuffed North's patriotic platitudes, saying, "You ask that Congress not cut off aid to the Contras for the love of God and for the love of country. Please remember that others share that devotion and recognize that it is possible for an American to disagree with you on aid to the Contras and still love God and still love this country just as much as you do. Although he's regularly asked to do so, God does not take sides in American politics. And in America, disagreement with the politics or policies of the government is not evidence of a lack of patriotism." So that message was at least aired in the halls of Congress in those days, whether people heard it or not. Moving on to the men's movement. These all, cross-pollinate, right, these movements? This is a name I don't remember. Edwin Lewis Cole, father of the Christian men's movement. Born in Dallas, let's see, in 1922, 100 years ago. Cole couched his call for Christian manhood in the language of the prosperity gospel. By following God's plan, men would, quote, enjoy Canaan land in every part of their lives, their marriages and families, their professional and financial lives. They would live the life of maximized manhood. Cole believed men had three purposes: to guide, guard, and govern. And to fulfill these roles they needed to be both tender and tough. Jesus was a perfect balance of the two. The same man who drew little children to himself gripped that scourge of cords and drove the money changers out of the temple. Cole had no use for sissified portraits of Jesus that failed to reveal his true character. Christ-likeness and manhood are synonymous, he insisted, and to be Christ-like, to be a man required a certain ruthlessness. When Cole appeared on Pat Robertson's 700 Club to argue that masculine leadership in the home required toughness, the female co-host balked, but Cole didn't back down, and he couldn't resist noting that his interlocutors seemed to be usurping properly masculine leadership on the program. He assured his readers that women were in fact begging for men to lead, and when men did lead, women loved them more. Cole took pains to distinguish toughness from a macho conception of manhood, which to him connoted a childlike immaturity, lack of character, and promiscuous sexuality. But even as Cole's understanding of masculinity retained a place of tenderness, measured tenderness should never be confused with effeminacy. I like a man's man, Cole made plain. I don't like the pussyfooting pipsqueaks who tiptoe through the tulips. At one time, people might have overemphasized toughness, Cole acknowledged, but today it is the softness that's killing us. Women, children, churches, and nations all needed masculine decision makers. America was great only when its men were great. Tragically, however, a pernicious anti-hero syndrome plagues our nation. There you go. So, that Vietnam echo, say something about that.
What I said earlier about there was still this lingering distaste about how Vietnam ended and American machoism was sent home with its tail between its legs, and that was still around and kind of driving a lot of this.
Oh, okay. So late 80s, early 90s, Jerry Falwell sparked controversy by characterizing AIDS as, quote, the wrath of God upon homosexuals, and recommending that those with AIDS be quarantined. I don't think we can forget that. I don't think Ronald Reagan ever said one thing about AIDS. That was a huge omission. I suppose he must have thought he couldn't do it or something. Okay, Pat Robertson. In 1991, the Cold War officially came to an end. For more than 4 decades, evangelicals had mobilized against an imminent communist threat. With American power restored and their enemy vanquished, the need for evangelical militarism was no longer self-evident. Nothing if not creative, Pat Robertson led the way in identifying the requisite crisis. Having failed in his presidential bid, Robertson used the millions of names on his campaign mailing list to found the Christian Coalition. In 1991, he published The New World Order, arguing that President Bush, the first President Bush, was being duped into thinking the threat of communism was over. In his view, totalitarianism had returned to the former Soviet bloc in a more deceptive and dangerous form. He also accused Bush of launching the Iraq War as a devious plot to secede American sovereignty to the United Nations. That's the first Iraq War. Inspired by their interpretation of biblical prophecies in the book of Revelation, conservative protesters had long feared a one-world government that would be ruled over by the Antichrist. That's the movie we watched a clip from in the beginning about the end of the world, right? In the early 20th century, these fears had attached to the League of Nations, and during the Cold War, these fears were often channeled into virulent anti-communism through Hal Lindsey's best-selling Late Great Planet Earth, and warned of European community that would usher in the reign of the devil. With the fall of the Soviet Union, suspicions fell squarely on the UN, and in the case of Robertson, on the Illuminati, on wealthy Jewish bankers, and on conspiratorial corporate internationalists. The Wall Street Journal dismissed Robertson's book as, quote, a predictable compendium of the lunatic fringe's greatest hits, unquote, written in an energetically crackpot style. Meanwhile, it climbed to number 4 on the New York Times bestseller list, selling 500,000 copies. Okay, under the leadership of Ralph Reed, Robertson's Christian Coalition quickly grew into the most powerful grassroots organization of the religious right, building networks in all 50 states and claiming more than 1 million members by 1994. Okay. Going there. Then we got 1992, Bill Clinton's running against George Bush. On the campaign trail in 1992, Hillary's feminism became a point of contention when, in response to the insinuation that her law firm had received favors from her husband when he was governor, she retorted, "I suppose I could have stayed home, baked cookies, and had teas." The backlash was swift and brutal. "If I ever entertained the idea of voting for Bill Clinton," one woman wrote in a letter to Time magazine, "the smug bitchiness of his wife's comments had nipped that notion in the bud." Yeah. We wouldn't be sitting here if she hadn't talked about the deplorables, right? This book would not have been written, but that one statement was just enough to put a certain person over the. I have absolutely no doubt that that's the case. So goes. All right, Promise Keepers. Anybody know anything about the Promise Keepers movement? Oh, what? Coach Mack. Oh, Colorado football, right. Hey, yeah. In the summer of 1997, around 700 Christian men streamed into the nation's capital to stand in the gap, to step up as men of God, to keep their promises, to honor and obey God, protect their families, pursue virtue, and influence their world. 6 years earlier, 4,200 men had attended the first Promise Keepers rally, the brainchild of Bill McCartney, then head football coach at the University of Colorado. McCartney had experienced a personal and religious crisis after his daughter had given birth to a child fathered by one of his players. Realizing that he had failed to prioritize his family, he ended up leaving his Catholic church for the evangelical Vineyard Christian Fellowship. Thinking he wasn't alone in his struggles, he decided to issue a call for a renewal of Christian manhood. Right. I was going to say a word about the Vineyard thing. One of you mentioned Vineyard, right? You want to say anything about the Vineyard? You want to give us 25 words or less?
I've been to that were evangelical-ish, for me.
It was just another big box?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was my experience. But I was a kid. I didn't really.
Okay,
I was a
you were
kid. I didn't have a lot of
You didn't know.
theological
Right.
distinctions at the time.
California, I came out of California mostly, right? And they had one doctrine. The minister had to wear a Hawaiian shirt. I'm making fun of it, but I always wondered about that. And then in the late 90s, this is a side thing completely. In the late 90s, not a few, but a good number of these Vineyard ministers who'd had churches of 1,000 or more became Russian Orthodox priests. Do you know about this? Does some of you know about this? Became Russian Orthodox priests. They went from California beach, surfing, Christian, what's it called, 7-Eleven music? You say 7 words 11 times or something like that. Here, and it just floored me. And I met some of these people, and they said, there wasn't any there in the Vineyard movement. We sang Christian songs, and we wore our shirts that were appropriate, and we got a lot of money, but it was kind of vapid. And so we had to find the one true church. This is their move. We had to then find, rather than decide maybe there is not one church, no, they had to find the one true church, and the one church that spoke the loudest to them was the Russian Orthodox, because Orthodox means what? Correct, right, okay. So here's what one Vineyard minister says. This is not in our book, but I for one, find this fascinating. And this is by someone who was a Presbyterian first, and then became a Vineyard pastor, right? Because Presbyterianism is so dull, right? And regimented. And then became the Russian Orthodox priest. My move from the Presbyterian Church to the Vineyard Christian Fellowship in 1989 had brought with it a time of genuine excitement and worship. I loved joining together with others to sing the contemporary Christian songs of the Vineyard. With hands lifted up and eyes closed, we worshiped the Lord with all our hearts. The carefree informality of the services was refreshing. But after a time, many of us began to ask, quote, isn't there more to worship than simply singing good contemporary Christian songs? The moment I first entered the sanctuary of an Orthodox church, I knew I had found something more. I smelled the incense immediately, and I thought of the bowls of incense mentioned in the book of Revelation. I saw the icons and knew that I was surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses and was part of the one church in heaven and on earth. One true church. As the deacon led the people in the litany of intercessory prayers, the priest chanted prayers and petitions, and the congregation sang their responses. I experienced a fullness in worship that was clearly lacking in our Vineyard services. I felt that rather than calling on God to come down and do something charismatic, we were being lifted into heaven by the Spirit in order to join the heavenly worship of our high priest Jesus, surrounded by all the saints who had gone on before us to their rest. During the month of December 1992, I had attended many services at a beautiful Orthodox church in my area. Returning to our Vineyard services, I found them to be barren and lacking by comparison. It was as if we had been eating one single item from a 10-course meal, never tasting any of the other entrees, and never experiencing the fullness of the banquet that God had prepared for us. Very powerful statement. And I've been to Orthodox worship. It makes my eyes, I'm gobsmacked by how powerful it is. So anyway, that's interesting how they made, it's like the Spirit's moving in all of us and in some pretty amazing ways. Okay, that was an aside. Despite talk of sacrifice, tenderness, and servanthood, however, it was hard to ignore language like that of Tony Evans in 7 Promises of a Promise Keeper, the organization's best-selling book. Men shouldn't ask for their leadership role back, Evans insisted. They needed to take it back. There can be no compromise here. Men must lead for the sake of families and the survival of our culture. On the very rare occasion when a woman was invited to address a Promise Keepers event, Holly Phillips, wife of President Randy Phillips, asked men to forgive women for their lack of respect, for the, quote, the demeaning and belittling words we have uttered, and for the ways we have coddled and smothered you with our protectiveness, thereby emasculating you. To critics, Promise Keepers simply marketed male supremacy with a beatific smile. In their view, servant leadership helped salvage a patriarchal order even as men no longer maintain their role as providers. By promising intimacy in exchange for power, servant leadership passed off authority as humility, ensuring that patriarchal authority would endure even in the midst of a changing time. As far as critics were concerned, this was more insidious than a straightforward power grab. Oh, well. Oh, the Apostle Paul, after all, urged disciples of Christ to run the race before them. And so they use that as the way of saying this is a, the sports metaphor became huge. So it's hard to have, there's all these balls in the air. There's pro football, right? And there's men and, oh my gosh, just kind of, it helps you see things and hear things you wouldn't understand in the culture today if you didn't know where they came from over the last 45 years. Promise Keepers' pursuit of, here's this other piece. Promise Keepers began to invite black community members into their midst and black men to come. And of course, there's a lot of black football players as well, right? So they're part of this. And the whole thing went to hell pretty quickly because they became interracial. There's no other way around it. She makes the case really clearly here that the whole movement it was like a balloon deflating. As soon as it became more than a group of white guys, the white guys didn't want to come anymore, which is pretty strong, but there it is. Then you've got the fine-tuning. There's this debate that's always going on in the men's movement, the men's Christian movement, between how tender we can be, right? Because some people were saying, you have to be tough and tender. That's how it began with that guy named Cole, who I mentioned first. But there are these repeated attempts in new books written by new leaders of the movement to throw the tender out the window and to just be tough, which is kind of fascinating if you look at it. In 1996, 40% of complaints registered by conference participants were negative responses to the theme of racial reconciliation. Okay, that was the end of the racial thing. So Gordon Dalby wrote a book called Healing the Masculine Soul. He said, women were crying out for men to recover their manly strength. Dalby insisted they were begging men to toughen up and take charge, longing for a prince who was strong and bold enough to restore their authentic femininity. Unfortunately, the church was part of the problem, failing to present the true Jesus, and instead depicted him, quote, as a meek and gentle milquetoast character, unquote, a man who never could inspire brawny fishermen like Peter to follow him. Okay? It was time to replace the Sunday school Jesus with the warrior Jesus, citing significant parallels between serving Christ and serving in the military. Dalby suggested that a, quote, redeemed image of the warrior could reinvigorate the church's ministry to men. What if we told men up front that to join the Church of Jesus Christ is, quote, to enlist in God's army and to place their lives on the line? This approach would be based on the warrior spirit in every man, and so would offer the greatest hope for restoring authentic Christian manhood to the body of Christ. Writing before the Gulf War had restored faith in American power and the strength of the military, Dalby's preoccupation with Vietnam is understandable. This is what Dan was talking about. Yet the pattern he established would endure long after an easy victory in the latter conflict supposedly bringing an end to the Vietnam syndrome. American evangelicals would continue to be haunted by Vietnam. Then this book called Tender Warrior. So it's going back and forth. Stu Weber opened his book Tender Warrior in, quote, the heat and terror of Vietnam, but he wrote about personal experience. A 1967 graduate of Wheaton College, Weber had strayed from his spiritual roots during, quote, the social and intellectual turmoil of the 60s. But as a Green Beret in Vietnam, he had come face to face with death, drawing him back to his faith. His was a book about manliness, real, God-made, down in the bedrock masculinity, something that men were scrambling to understand. The confusion was everywhere evident. Were men tender or tough, strong or sensitive? All this confusion left men frustrated but also determined to discover our manhood and live it to the hilt. Weber, too, believed that a gender war was being waged, and it was necessary to look culture's confusion straight in the eye. Channeling Dobson and Elizabeth Elliot, Weber insisted that men and women were profoundly different. Here, Weber turned to the ancient Hebrew word for man, ish, which meant piercer, and the Hebrew word for women, isha, or pierced one, insisting that the distinction went beyond the obvious anatomical or sexual elements. In this case, the physical was a parable of the spiritual. Man at his core was tough and strong, a risk taker, an initiator, a piercer, one who penetrates, moves forward, advances toward the horizon, and leads. Women, on the other hand, preferred security and order. They were gentle responders, tender companions, aloneness fighters. I don't know what that means. These differences were woven through all of Scripture, and nothing was more pitiful, quote, than a man forfeiting his masculinity or a woman her femininity by transgressing the created order. Okay. So, and then there was Jesus, the ultimate man, he writes, the complete hero. Tragically, images of Jesus had been grossly disfigured by, quote, a media that either hates and distorts him or vastly misunderstands him. Too many men had become victims of a demasculinized portrait of Christ, making it difficult for them to follow Jesus and leaving them looking elsewhere for a model of manhood. In the final chapter of the Bible, Weber reminded readers, Jesus, quote, closes the book on a white war horse in a blood-spattered robe with a sword in his mouth and a rod of iron in his hand. The Bible ended in a roar, not a whimper. So that's what we're dealing with here. And when asked, about the Sermon on the Mount and the part about blessed are the peacemakers, is the point that he answers is, yes, Jesus is a peacemaker, even a pacifist, but that's after the end of the war. So that's kind of convenient thinking. Yes?
Manhood. And I don't know, is anybody familiar with Amendment 2? Was that a nationwide? All I know is Colorado, sorry, keep going back there because they're in the pits, because we became known as the hate state, because there was a law, and I don't know the facts, I'm sorry, to clarify it, but the bottom line was it was seeking equal, for homosexuals and everything, and Colorado voted it down. And we became known as the hate state because, golly, if you start having homosexuals, God, what's going to happen to the men? You know what I'm saying? They couldn't tolerate the concept of man, woman coming to be as one. And I'm not speaking well of it. I just wondered if anybody was familiar with that point in history. And it's just another example of where I've had firsthand experience with being with folks who, they feared for their manliness so much that they couldn't allow for homosexuality or anything like that. Just another example.
Okay. The last little piece for this week is about the Mars Hill Church in Seattle, where Mark Driscoll kind of takes the man thing and just goes over the top with it completely. Like celebrity evangelists before him, Driscoll mastered cutting-edge communications technology. The internet is the Greek marketplace of Acts 17, proclaiming the church's visitor guide. Film and anyway, that's not where I want to go. In language that would have been familiar to many among his flock, Driscoll insisted that real men avoided church because they had no interest in a Richard Simmons hippie queer Christ. So now they're really saying what they've been thinking all along, right? But Jesus was no long-haired, effeminate-looking dude. He was a man like Driscoll's own working-class dad, a construction worker who swung a hammer for a living, a man with calluses on his hands and muscles on his frame. Jesus bore no resemblance to the drag queen Jesus images that portrayed him with long, flowing, feathered hair, perfect teeth, and soft skin, draped in a comfortable dress customized by matching open-toed sandals and handbag. He was an aggressive, anger-filled leader who picked fights with religious authorities, slaughtered thousands of pigs, ordered his disciples around, and didn't mind causing offense. Jesus was a hero, not a loser, an ultimate fighter, warrior king with a tattoo down his leg, who rides into battle against Satan, sin, and death on a trusty horse, just like in the Westerns. That's...
Slaughtered thousands of pigs.
Yeah. Right.
Somehow I don't think they'd like a Jesus in farm country who went out and slaughtered thousands of pigs.
No, okay, right.
They did like that.
Did the Jews have?
Somebody did in Palestine.
You'll excuse me for going to the basics. But I look at these writers. What were they getting? And who are they attracting? A lot of the religious, what we call the religious right, what are they dealing with? Fear. And what groups this people together? Fear. So when it comes to a political movement, a religious movement, other than the initiators building mega churches, living mega yachts, making a lot of millions of dollars, they're dealing in fear. And we allow people to deal in fear, rather than fear of the military, fear of anything. We really are biting into this. And you go back in history to Romans, they dealt in fear.
Oh, yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
You deal in Henry VIII, he dealt in fear.
Yeah.
So my only point is, look at these people, what are they getting out of it? Money and abiding people's fear.
And a certain amount of power, yeah.
Well, and I was just going to say fear that that these white men will lose their place at the top. So it's about white supremacy.
There was that. I will say something that back in 1984, I'm guessing, pastor over in the Cully neighborhood of Portland, I remember a woman came to me. She wanted to talk to me alone after worship. We're sitting in the fellowship hall, and she told me she wanted two things from me. To the pastor, I needed to guarantee to her that her husband would never leave her and that her children wouldn't take drugs. That was my job as pastor. And that said it all. I mean, it really, you're talking about fear. I mean, those were, yeah. If the church couldn't guarantee that, she wasn't interested in coming. And so it's you know, there's the male side, there's the female side. There's so much going on here. And that was my job as pastor. I can't remember what
I wanted to add that the handmaiden of fear is anger, which is the other thing that they're trading in, at least the current, right-wing fanatics. I don't know if you, it kind of cracked me up when Trump was announcing jumping into, a new election bid, and said, well, yeah, there's other people out there that want to be president, but I'm angrier than all of them.
Is that what he said?
Yeah, he said that.
That's fascinating.
He's not a well man. Thank you very much. In one sentence, the anacronym, if I have the right noun there, for fear, false emotions appearing real.
False
Emotions appearing real.
That's interesting. I've
That's
never heard
fear.
that. Okay. Well, I think we've spent our wad tonight. This is hard. And I don't know what to make of it, except, hopefully we'll be alert to these themes, because obviously if they keep appearing and appearing and appearing and appearing, we're not out of the woods yet with this by any means. Well, hopefully we can recognize some of it. Thank God she wrote the book. Right. So we're dealing with page 200 to 300 next time, bringing it up to date as best we can.
And my copy of the book's available to loan if anybody would like to take it home and bring it back next week or sometime in the future. I've still got it.